Okay, hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sasha.
Glad to have you. And Ivan Kucherenko from Kyiv, Ukraine. Welcome to the show, Ivan.
Hello, Sasha. Hi, Jonathan. Hello, everyone.
Ivan, so what is happening in Belgorod? What's your opinion? Please.
Unfortunately or luckily, I'm not in Belgorod, but I'm in Kyiv. But I like what's happening here. Hopefully, Russian population are so tired of Putin rule that they've decided to at least not to say that they can do nothing with Putin and his Kremlin fellows, and started to fight against them. And this is good because such battles on Russian territory distract Russian attention from Ukraine. They have to regroup some troops there in order to fight those armed rebels, but I hope that they will be succeeded, and we will see the rise of Belgorod People Republic in Russia, and Bryansk People Republic as well, and other People Republic of Russians, because they like so-called People Republics so much that I hope the whole Russian Federation one time will collapse into a huge number of different People Republics. And this process already started in Belgorod and Bryansk.
Ivan, tell me, do you think Ilya Ponomarev has anything to do with this attack?
I don't know. There are so many so-called good Russians that I'm not sure who is responsible to that. I know that there are two armed groups of Russians who were the part of Ukrainian army, so-called Legion of Free Russia, Legion Svoboda России, and
Yes.
another one, and another one.
But one group is Free Russians, and another one even more Free Russians.
Yeah. I don't know who of Russian so-called opposite politicians support them and are responsible for them. I think that Russian opposition, including Kasparov, Khodorkovsky, they just all the time they just talk about nothing. They can't even argue and unite on themselves on some points, and I'm not sure that they can arrange any kind of armed rebellion in Russia. But former Russian soldiers, former soldiers of Putin army, who are in those Russian troops, they hopefully at last arranged it, and we've seen in the news that they've previously breached the Russian border to show that Russian FSB security service, which is responsible for guarding Russian border, is so useless as a Russian army, and now they've striked Russian territory with even more forces, and this time they've captured several villages or small towns on Russian territory. And as far as I know, they are going to the huge huge weapon warehouses, military bases, which are stationed in Belgorod region, and in order to get even more weapons and to beat Putin army by their own weapons. So I really hope that they will be succeeded in it, and that war that Putin and majority of Russian population wanted so much to strike Ukraine, it will like a boomerang strike Russian territory, and they will see all the aspects of war on Russian territory.
Okay, Jonathan, what's your opinion about this affair, and what is you see happening?
The fact that there is any kind of armed resistance taking place on Russian territory at all is indicative of the lack of solid Russian support for the war in Ukraine. It's just the fact that there is any physical armed resistance at all taking place. It is not the monolithic block of support for Putin that the Russians have been trying to portray thus far. So when you add to that internal lack of cohesion, to the ongoing massive casualties that the Russians are taking in Ukraine, but even they're trying to portray their so-called occupation of Bakhmut. They claim that they have occupied Bakhmut, but it's practically a shell, almost like the once observer claimed, like Hiroshima. And they are surrounded on three sides and close to being surrounded on all sides. So they're trying to portray this as an advance, as a victory. In addition to the lack of internal cohesion, it is not at all consistent. So the fact that the resistance is taking place in Belgorod, yeah, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's more taking place beneath the surface than we see at present, and just keep in mind that the Ukrainian armed forces are keeping those refitted armored brigades ready to deliver the Sunday punch at any moment, and to deliver a real counteroffensive punch. And so there is no cause for optimism on the Russian side. There is cause that the Russians' will to fight is being steadily eroded.
Yeah, and I think as time goes by, it will go even farther and farther. The war is definitely not popular among Russian people. A lot of people already lost their closest relatives. More people will lose more of those relatives, and there is a resistance to go to serve in the army. The war is definitely not popular with Russians. However, while Putin is in power, the war will go on. He will never stop it. And unfortunately, there are consequences of that. The more innocent people are dying, the armies are getting exhausted, just to satisfy one crazy dictator. I'm trying to be very selective in my words and not to not to say obscenities in address of Putin, which I love to do it, and I do it privately. But here on this forum, I'm trying to be very polite and very reserved. Now, latest situation in Bakhmut, Ivan, what would you report on that?
As far as I know, that Ukrainian troops are advancing on the north and the southern part of Bakhmut. They're controlling the heights in this region, and actually Bakhmut is not just a city, but a defense region itself. It's much more complicated than just the city. And Russians who captured majority of the city, Ukrainian forces, as far as I know, control the very few territory of city itself, but they're controlling the rest of the defense region of defense, and they're advancing north and south and trying to surrender Russian troops. That's why the troops of Wagner Group, so-called Prigozhin, they're trying to flee from Bakhmut as soon as possible, and Prigozhin is claiming that they captured Bakhmut. They've done what he promised to Putin. It took almost 300 days from him to capture Bakhmut, almost a year capturing small city, small regional city on the eastern part of Ukraine, and it's far from capturing the rest of the Donetsk region by Russian troops. And so Prigozhin understands that if this situation will go on like it's going now, the Russian troops in Bakhmut will be completely surrounded and exterminated. So he's trying to save the remains of his Wagner group because he lost a lot of soldiers during so-called meat grinder, their meat grinder advancing on Ukrainian defenders. So Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut, they're completing their mission to destroy as many Russians as possible, while Russians' mission or Russians' goal in Bakhmut is just to capture this city, which has no strategic value at all, just to say to Putin that they've captured that one more city in Donetsk region.
Yes, Jonathan. Jonathan, I was looking at the map of Bakhmut, and the idea was that if Russians would take Bakhmut, they could continue their attack to further Ukrainian targets in that region. But I don't think that Russians had any goals beyond Bakhmut, or even if they had them, they're unattainable right now. What do you think, Jonathan?
They don't have the it was obvious that they never had the capability to exploit any success they might have gained in Bakhmut. Bakhmut, as I pointed out in an earlier program, is somewhat similar. It's similar to two previous battles in history. One, the Battle of Verdun in World War I, where the Germans hoped to turn Verdun into an effective meat grinder against the French. As it turned out, both sides took horrendous casualties, but it wasn't decisive, and it really didn't do anything, and the Germans any good. And the other is I compare it to the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, the town of Bastogne. If you look at the map of the Ardennes in the Ardennes offensive, Bastogne is the center of a spider web of road networks. I mean, all roads literally led to Bastogne, which is why the Germans were so desperate to try and take it and encircle it. And the American 101st Division successfully held on to that, and it became a springboard for a counteroffensive for the American army against the German Bulge. So in this sense, even if the Germans had managed to take Bastogne, there were massive American reinforcements able to defend all roads leading out of Bastogne. So really, in the same way, the Russians have had no credible operational reserves to exploit any kind of success from Bakhmut. So really, you can just sort of discount their threats of being able to exploit anything, but they just expended a lot of troops for nothing.
So there are very little military reasons for Russians to take over Bakhmut, especially at the price of at least 50,000 killed, if not more.
President Biden said that according to the U.S. intelligence, Russian lost 100,000 of soldiers.
Yes, you're right. I've
Bakhmut.
heard that as well. So so they lost half of their dead soldiers are in Bakhmut because they lost over 200,000. So think about it. Half of those people were sacrificed just to take over Bakhmut, which at this point is not even a city. It remains of the city. It's absolutely rubbles. And however, and from what I heard, there is still resistance of Ukrainian soldiers in at least in one part of the city. But what more important is that there are Ukrainian armies are encircling Bakhmut, but partially because there is on north there is a river, Bakhmut River. So that becoming sort of joined from left and right by Ukrainian forces. So therefore, it will be very difficult for Russians to escape. I think they can still try to escape now, and that's what Prigozhin is trying to do, and very rightly so, because there is no business to stay in Bakhmut. To do what? It's rubble. There is nothing going on. Why would anybody be crazy enough to stay in a place like that? That's beyond me, of course.
Well, unless Putin is imitating Hitler in World War II by not withdrawing from Stalingrad when he was there, and it was clear that the Soviet army was preparing to encircle the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad, but yet Hitler gave a no retreat order, and so the Germans were pocketed in Stalingrad, and that was a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front. So here, you have history, as Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself. It does rhyme, though. So in this case, in a minor sort of farcical sort of way, Putin's refusal to pull out, or wanting to pull out from Bakhmut, is going to replay another disaster for the Russians, only this time for the Russians rather than the Germans.
Yeah, I agree, Jonathan. Ivan, do you have a movie for us to show?
Yeah, I have a really nice movie about Ukrainian soldiers.
Excellent.
I'd like to share with you today.
Let's see it.
Yeah.
Imagine your life. You make breakfast, go to work, celebrate birthdays. You're a teacher, a musician, or a lawyer. But one day, the Russian army invades your country, and you have to go to fight. To protect your country from invaders, to protect your house from looters, to protect your children from rapists. This is what happened in Ukraine. It is not only professional soldiers that make up the armed forces of Ukraine, but also volunteers.
Сьогодні дійсно в армії можна знайти як поетів, музикантів, так і слюсарів, так і робітників якогось великого або малого бізнесу.
When armed aggression began in the east of Ukraine in 2014, ordinary people went to defend their land and volunteer battalions began to form. And queues of those who wanted to defend Ukraine lined up for military commissars after the full-scale invasion in 2022.
Так як підтримують нашу армію українці, не підтримують, я думаю, жодну армію у світі. Народ живе разом зі своєю армією, зі своїм військом, разом прокидається і лягає з думкою про Збройні Сили України, і ми це відчуваємо завжди, і це надає сил.
Take a look at the Ukrainian soldiers. This is a musician. This is a comedian. This is a poet. This is a scientist. This is a lawyer. This is an actor. They all paused their careers and stood up to defend their country.
Я знаю, що пліч-опліч зі мною краще, міцніше за сталь, запекліше за вогонь, сильніше за будь-яку стихію. Серця українських воїнів б'ються в унісон із серцями мільйонів співгромадян і всіх волелюбних людей світу.
Ukrainians don't just respect their army. We are one living organism that stood up to protect its family.
Народ, який перемагає терор. Мільйони людей, які кожен на своєму місці. наближають вирішальний день, день перемоги.
Very powerful movie. I totally agree with every word, every statement there. Jonathan, I would like to compare this war with any other wars that U.S. was fighting. Let's see, start with the Vietnam War, for example, where U.S., a superpower with nuclear capabilities and so on, couldn't win the war against people who are fighting for their land, for their people, and eventually had to withdraw from there. Is there any similarity with this war and what's happening between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, in the Vietnam War, I recall reading about one of our negotiators after the war remarked to the North Vietnamese colonel, said, "You know, you never defeated our armies on the battlefield." And the North Vietnamese colonel replied, "That is quite true. It is also irrelevant." Yeah, he was absolutely correct. Yeah, they did not have to. The North Vietnam did not have to defeat the American armies in the battlefield. What they had to defeat and what they aimed at correctly from the beginning was in defeating the American will to fight. The will of the American political leadership to sustain a long drawn out and conflict with no clear criteria for victory. In much the same way, I would say that the more applicable example would be our involvement in Afghanistan. We spent 20 years in that country, and we never had, and the thing that I hold American military leadership blame for, as well as the politicians, is that they never had a clear objective. They never had a clear criteria for what constitutes victory in Afghanistan. And so the American army and the American nation was caught in a forever war, a war with no determined ending, until finally we just decided, hey, we're out of here, and which is an admission of defeat, because you never had established a criteria for what constitutes victory. When do you stop the military action? So I would say that in terms of what is a more applicable parallel, I would say that the war in Afghanistan, our invasion of Afghanistan, is a more applicable example and comparable to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You know, the Russians say that their invasion of Ukraine, well, was a special military operation and not a real war. Well, guess what? It's a real war. To the Ukrainians, it's a real war with a clear objective: get the Russians out of Ukraine and leave us alone.
Jonathan, but it's becoming now a real war for Russians too. And I'm not talking about just Belgorod situation. I'm talking about over 200,000 people killed, and each one had a family to mourn or so on. So now more and more Russian society is being affected by war. I remember one of the things that led to a crash of Soviet Union was Afghan war, which was going on for 8, maybe even 9 years until full withdrawal. And Russia in this 9 years lost 15,000 people. And there was so much tragedy, personal tragedies, people who mourn their loved ones. But that's just the beginning. After the Afghan war, when there was perestroika already in full swing in war, all this military, quasi-military, the bandits, the groups, they were headed by Afghanistan veterans. Most of the bandits in Moscow were headed by Afghan veterans simply because they had military experience, they knew how to organize things and so on. What can you imagine when hundreds of thousands of fighters from Ukraine, Russian fighters, will come back to Russia? What do you think they are going to do? Are they going to work as lawyers or doctors or scientists or musicians? I don't think so. I really don't. So then we will have even more upheavals in Russia. There will be more unrest in the society. And I think this old, how to say nicely, Thomas Friedman wrote an essay, is the biggest idiot in Russia of all time, about Putin. What he's done with this country, this fool. He ran economy into the ground. He completely exterminated Russian oil and gas business. He killed over 200,000 people. The Russia has become absolutely ostracized country all over the world. Nobody wants to even talk or see Putin at all. What he's done with this country, how it could be justified any way. What is he talking about now? That NATO was prepared to attack Russia? Do you know that NATO, until recently, they didn't have even capable production of artillery shell or many of the types of ammunition, and only lately in the last 2, 3 or so months they started to ramp up production. So NATO was not ready for any war with anybody. It was a situation where NATO existed just for its existence. It didn't have any clear goals, it didn't have any aspirations, it didn't have nothing until Ukraine happened. Now NATO is well justified. Why do they exist? What they need to do? And I think they're doing a pretty well capable job. Do you think so, Jonathan?
Well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has given NATO a renewed reason for existence and for
Yeah, take
expansion and for
Finland.
strengthening. So it's the Russia. Putin did NATO a huge favor by his miscalculation, and
Jonathan,
so that. Go ahead.
even 2 years ago, do you think Finland or Sweden would even think about joining the NATO?
No, they wouldn't have been thinking about it then. They would both Finland and Sweden would have wanted to maintain their studied neutrality, because they thought that was the best possible situation.
Right.
But then when Russia invaded Ukraine and constituted a clear threat to those Nordic states, well, they rethought their position very quickly. And now they what Putin has done, he has galvanized NATO. He has galvanized and expanded NATO. And quite arguably, once this war is concluded, hopefully with a Ukrainian victory and the Russians forced to withdraw, then you will have an even stronger NATO, because you will have Ukraine, on NATO's eastern flank. You will have Finland, Ukraine, the Baltic states forming a line, with Belarus being in the position of sitting out there exposed. And as I pointed out, they've never had a very strong national identity to begin with.
Yes.
They would be very, with proper diplomatic pressure and other types of pressure and offers of, rapprochement, possibly even Belarus could be convinced to join NATO. And then you would have a very solid wall in the east. And defending that wall would be comparatively much easier.
And
Because
it's
then
not just, Jonathan, it's not just East. I was really puzzled by decision of NATO open an office in Japan, because NATO is North American Treaty Organization, and all of a sudden they're thinking about opening an office in Japan. What do you think about this?
Well, that makes sense in a larger strategic sense. Remember what I pointed out, that the success of the Patriot ballistic missiles defense system in Ukraine and others, and it's a very superior success rate of intercept, is a portent of the potential success of a global ballistic missile defense.
Yeah.
Global. Now, Japan would be interested in being part of such a global ballistic missile defense system. If NATO and the U.S. band together to do things such as expanding ballistic missile defense forces, upgrading, for example, the U.S. Space Force, that potentially could include a space fleet, which Japan and NATO members could become allied members of. They could contribute crew members to the units of a space force, making the
And
U.S.
then
Space
North
Force.
Korea, North
Say-
Korea would follow probably.
Yeah, North Korea
Sorry,
would be
South Korea. Sorry, my mistake.
South Korea could join a ballistic missile defense space force and make
Mhm.
a truly multinational space force. That is how they could participate, by contributing people with sufficiently high technological backgrounds, which could be members of such a space force. So that would be their entry point, not physically contributing troops on the ground, but contributing in a global ballistic missile defense force. So there is an indirect route here for the participation of Japan and South Korea with NATO. So
And then
it's a very interesting path.
don't forget about alliance with Australia.
Again,
would
because
encircle China as well.
a global ballistic missile defense force, because of its very nature, a global ballistic missile defense force would not have to pay attention to geographical location on the ground. Australia, South Korea, Japan, they could contribute, as I said, allied members to a space force's space fleet. That space fleet could participate in global ballistic missile defense, control of Earth orbital space, and indirectly and directly impact the strategic positions of China and North Korea. Well, if a global ballistic missile defense force can neutralize the nuclear arsenal of Russia, it can also, by extension, neutralize the ballistic missile forces of China and North Korea more easily.
Absolutely correct. Jonathan, I would like to thank very much for your participation today, and I'm looking forward to have even better news by Friday. See you same time, same day, and also hope Ivan will join us as well. Thank you very much. Slava Ukraini.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.